and welcome to the first episode of Zilog and Moto in the year of our Lord 2022, the first episode of Season 4. Season 4! Can you believe that? This is now my 4th year of doing Zilog and Moto, and I couldn't be happier. And yeah, technically the anniversary won't be till sometime in February, but who's counting? I'm certainly not. So, what is Zilog and Moto? What is it that I've been doing for these last 3 years? Well, take a look at this wall behind me. This wall currently contains 834 games for the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. I say currently because ultimately I'm looking to bring in about another 400 titles to have the complete English language collections for each of those consoles. However, I don't want to just have this giant wall of plastic, paper, and silicon to collect dust. Oh, no. I buy these games to play them, and then not just play them, but share my experience with them to all of you out there. Anyone can review a video game, but do you want a review from just anyone, or do you want a review from someone who's deep into these libraries and was there when these games were originally released? And that's the channel. Each week, I pick a game from this library, play it, and then report back with my findings. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. But the worst ones, those are the ones that are just kind of, be good, be bad, be something. Anyway, if that sounds interesting to you at all, I recommend that you subscribe, and that way you'll know when new videos go up, and it will help the channel get recognition, and then other people might be able to enjoy it as well, and hopefully learn something. I know I definitely do every week. Okay, shameless self-promotion over with, now let's move on to the game of the week, and this week's title is actually a somewhat, I won't call it sad, but definitely somber event. On December 28th of last year, about a week ago as of the writing of the script, legendary football coach and announcer John Madden passed away at the age of 85. Being at that age, John had long since actively been involved with football, retiring from announcing 12 years ago after doing Super Bowl 43 in 2009. So it's altogether possible that there's a whole generation of Madden players out there who have never actually seen John and not really had any sort of point of reference as to why this long-running series was named after him, rather than just some generic name like NFL 2K22. And I think I just pissed off the Dreamcast contingent with that joke. Anyway, to talk about why the series is named after John Madden goes all the way back to 1984, when Trip Hawkins at Electronic Arts, in his long-running desire to make an accurate football sim, made contact with John, who was a few years removed from coaching at that point and had become a very visible commentator for CBS, along with a string of Miller Lite commercials, that the first cover of John Madden Football actually would draw inspiration from. John's savant-like mind for the game of college football made him the perfect resource for developers to work with in recreating the action from the gridiron into a video game that actually felt like football. And the results speak for themselves, with 33 yearly editions that have graced store shelves. Today, we're talking about the second edition of the game, and the first that would appear on a console, the Genesis version of John Madden Football, released in December of 1990, just in time for Christmas. We'll get to more details about this game that started a console institution in a bit, but first, a look at this package.
Okay, and this is my copy of John Madden Football, and you'll immediately notice that like most of the early Electronic Arts releases for the console, it was distributed in a cardboard box rather than a clamshell. Now, there is a second pressing out there, so to speak, of this that came in a clamshell, similar to Lakers vs. Celtics in the NBA playoffs, but this cardboard box is the original release, and it's a little bit more common to see. This box has certainly seen better days, with a lot of wear in the corners and some on the edges, but at least its structural integrity is still intact and hasn't been stepped on or crushed at some point. One other thing to note, if you look at this seam back here, this is where the box is glued together, and sometimes on these old EA boxes, the glue has dried out and this seam is separated, but thankfully the seal is still intact on this copy. As far as the front cover goes, it's got the classic EA half-and-half cover design, with nothing too special going on, just a picture of John overseeing two players fighting for the ball. One thing I do find interesting is that the cover references that the game is from Park Place Productions and John Madden, emphasizing the fact that John was actively involved in the design of the game, and wasn't just lending his likeness to the game, a la Joe Montana Football, or any of the many other celebrity-endorsed Sega sports titles. Flipping over the back, and if you couldn't already tell that this was an older title, here's a pretty clear indication with this plain yellow background, and I'm not even sure how many different fonts back here. The tagline alone has a mishmash of 3, not to mention this word art zaniness that goes along with these tiny football players. Block, dive, jump, break tackles. I feel like Patches O'Houlihan was consulted here for the design. The screenshots are also slightly blurry, but appropriate for the time period, and do a good job of showing off 4 different views of the game. I'm going to call one party foul here though, and that's the flavor text for this first picture. Call over 100 pro plays with ease. This is technically true, but that number is including offensive and defensive and special teams plays, so in reality, the playbook isn't probably as big as you think. More on that in a bit. Since this box is a bit fragile, I've already got the manual and cartridge out, and they've both held up well, with the cartridge having that unmistakable EA yellow tab. The manual has that stocky format that all of the EA Genesis manuals had. That was annoying because they would never stay in the slot designed for them because it was too short. But in a detail that probably 3 people in the world care about, did you know that the cardboard box releases had even shorter manuals? Here's the manual from Madden 92 for comparison's sake. As far as the contents of the manual, there's a decent amount here, but one thing they got absolutely right was having the very first page being dedicated to the controls of the game, which essentially acts like a quick start guide. Very cool. The rest of the manual goes into detail explaining how to play the game, with a decent amount of screenshots, and then towards the end, there's a confusing section that lists all of the Audible plays included in the game, which is unfortunately necessary due to the way the game is designed. Finally, at the end, there's breakdowns of the player ratings for each of the teams included in the game, which is nice for figuring out which team you might want to play as and which ones you probably want to avoid. Okay, that's the package. Let's take a look at the game that started it all. Spoiler, they did not get it all right the first time. So, to be clear, and I made reference to this earlier, but technically, this is not the first version of John Madden Football. It's the first version of John Madden Football to appear on a console, but like Lakers vs. Celtics and PGA Tour Golf, John Madden Football was preceded by a version of the game on home computers a year before. However, unlike Lakers vs. Celtics and PGA Tour Golf, the version of John Madden Football on home computers was much more primitive, with the Genesis version thankfully being a completely new version of the game, with it forming the basis of what would become John Madden Football 2 for DOS. Not to be confused with the Genesis sequel, John Madden Football 92. Just trust me, they're different games. Also, while we're getting things out of the way, let's go ahead and discuss that old Sega chestnut, the story about how the original Joe Montana Football almost didn't exist. I talked about this a bit in episode 27 when I reviewed the original Joe Montana Football for the Genesis, but now having the original John Madden Football to directly compare it to, I've got to say, I think certain statements about the connection between the two games may have been a bit overblown, or simply not accurate. For those of you not familiar with the story behind Joe Montana Football, Sega had decided to not develop the game internally, mainly because they couldn't at the time, and instead given it to Mediagenic, aka Activision, with the thinking being that Activision could convert one of their PC titles, Graveyardage, which was a football title with a fantasy theme, much more like Mutant League Football or Pigskin 621 AD, over to what would be a flagship title for the Genesis. Also, I'd like to point out some places online erroneously state that the game to be converted was Hard Yardage, which is actually a totally unrelated arcade football game that wouldn't come out until 1993 from Strata. It would have indeed been an interesting feat for Activision to convert an arcade game developed by a different company 3 years in the future to be Joe Montana Football. Blame Game Players magazine for the goof up. Anyway, long story short, Activision was super screwed up at the time, not unlike the Bobby Kotick-led version today, and there's no way they were delivering for Sega, so instead Sega leaned on partner Electronic Arts, who allowed Park Place Productions to simultaneously work on Joe Montana Football while developing John Madden Football. As you would expect with two football games being developed by the same team at the same time, the games have some similarities, notably some font choices and the play layouts. But honestly, other than that, there's very little else that's similar about the two games. At least from what was actually released to the market anyway. Developers and EA claimed that along with sandbagging Joe Montana Football by delaying it until after Christmas, there was also content removed and or downgraded from the game to make the titles less similar. The end result is, while yes, there are some similarities between the two titles, the implication that they're the same core game is simply not true. But let's table all that Joe Montana Football versus John Madden Football talk for a minute and actually concentrate on the game at hand. If you've ever played a 16-bit era Madden title, especially one pre-Madden 94, the original John Madden Football should look very familiar to you, as the game engine graphics used in the first 4 editions of the game are largely similar. What's probably not similar is the introduction to the game itself. After booting up the game and getting past the John Madden-centric title screen, you're placed into one of the most barren and simple game startup screens I think I've ever seen. At the beginning of the game, you can choose 4 things. The game mode, which selects between an exhibition game, sudden death, or playoff mode, the 2 teams competing and who should be controlling those 2 teams, a player or the computer, and finally, the length of the game, if it should be set for 5-minute quarters or 15-minute quarters. And that's it. Now, I get it's a football game. How many options would I expect to see? Well, there's no choice of weather conditions for one, so while the game technically supports rainy, muddy, and snowy games, apparently you will only see those if they're randomly selected in the playoffs. Also, there's no selections for difficulty. The game plays exactly how it is, and if you're getting stomped, your only choice is to get better at the game or choose a different team. Both of those are minor quibbles, admittedly, but it doesn't change the fact that starting up John Madden Football feels extremely stark and unpolished. There's something to be said for the idea of trying to get players into the game as quickly as possible, however. I think there's a balance there that they didn't quite hit. One final note about this intro screen: if you're using an official 6-button controller or perhaps one of the Retrobit wireless controllers based on it, this menu is incredibly twitchy. Actual gameplay seems to be fine, but you may get frustrated in choosing the teams and players due to that looser D-pad. The original 3-button controllers and the 8-bit DOE wireless controller don't have that issue, so hopefully that will be helpful to someone out there that runs into this problem. Once you've chosen the teams, game mode, and quarter length, it's off to the actual game. This is the strength of Madden, even in this early incarnation. However, even here, things seem a bit off. Or maybe primitive is the better word. I think one of the first things I noticed, and this is a small thing, is that there's no crowd. Sure, there's some extremely basic low-level white noise that represents the crowd, and it does go up in volume when something big like a touchdown happens, but from a graphical perspective, the football field is essentially played in a black void, with nothing beyond the edges. It's a bit strange to say the least, especially when you go back to the original Great Soccer from 1985 for the Master System that I looked at in episode 24, and even that simple of a title had not only an audience that surrounded the field, but one that animated when a goal was scored. The menu of choosing plays are a bit different as well, and it might throw you a bit if you're used to the newer games. On offense, you'll choose a personnel group, and then a formation, and then a play. And on defense, you'll choose a formation, then a style of defense, and then finally a play from that style. This is one of those places where John Madden's influence on the game is clear, as especially on defense, if you're not familiar with some of these terms, the choices might not make sense at first. For instance, on defense, you have to learn that control means basically run defenses or blitzes. Read is more of a zone, and cover is more of man-to-man, although technically there's a mix between read and cover. Also, there's only 4 defensive formations available: big, which is your goal line defense, 4-3, nickel, and dime. Coincidentally, on offense, there's only 4 formations as well: near, far, pro set, and shotgun, with each of those formations having a limited amount of plays and no way to flip them. Granted, these limitations are somewhat to be expected with this being the first game in the series, but it does show just how much has been added to the games over the years, and probably certain things that we take for granted that appear in later Madden games. One final note about play selection that I have to mention is the Audible System. I mentioned this a bit in the manual section, but this is definitely something that I feel like could have been handled better. All 17 of the teams in the game have 3 audibles on offense and 3 on defense that can be called at the line, if you feel like the offense or defense you originally called isn't going to work against what the other team has come to the line with. This is a good thing and adds to the realism of the game. However, these audibles are preset and different for each team, with the only way of knowing what the plays are for that team being to look at the chart in the manual. On top of that, there's certain plays that are only available via Audible, so if you don't have access to the manual, you'll be a bit lost. Did you know that some teams can run the Statue of Liberty play? Well, you wouldn't unless you had the manual. This almost feels like an old-school, manual-based home computer copy protection scheme, but obviously, you can still play the game without knowing these audibles. Beyond these aforementioned limitations of this early incarnation of the series, the game ultimately still feels like Madden. If you've played a later 16-bit era Madden title, you'll be able to pick up and play John Madden Football right away, with all the controls being largely the same as what's present in later games. And this is a good thing, as the game controls extremely well, with those controls largely part of why the series became so popular. It's not a fast arcade-style feel, and definitely does lean more into the simulation aspects, with slow players being slow, and the better teams definitely being tougher to beat. Having said that, no matter whom you're playing, you absolutely can't get lazy, as the computer will put up a decent fight. Case in point, when capturing gameplay for this video, I had made it to the championship game and gotten to a point where I was ahead by 2 touchdowns with 6 minutes to go. No problem, I thought. I've had a solid game so far. I run a play I'd had success with so far, a half-back screen, but rather than watch the screen, I just assumed the running back is going to go out into the flat. Well, no, for some reason he runs back into the line, and I end up throwing the ball into the middle of the line, which results in an interception return for a touchdown. No big deal, I thought. I'm still up a touchdown. When I get the ball back, I'll run the play again, thinking, there's no way that will happen twice. Oh, it did, as I did the same thing, and by just assuming the receiver was going to do one thing, rather than actually pay attention to the play, I ended up spelling my doom. Granted, the computer was probably cheating a little bit, but that's neither here nor there. As far as the graphics and sound goes, well, I've already mentioned that the field looks a bit weird with everything just surrounded by black, and the play selection GUI at the top of the screen is similarly dark. I also noticed a little bit of flicker occasionally when a lot of players would be in the same area, but this was minimal and doesn't affect gameplay. The colors for the teams are chosen well, as while there is no official licensing to the game, the teams are based off their real-life counterparts. And I do like how the field will change depending on the weather conditions. The sound effects are solid, with some decent early digital speech, and the bits of music that are present sound good, which makes sense as all of the audio in the game was produced by the legendary Rob Hubbard, as he did for many other EA titles of the era. Believe it or not, John Madden Football is a tough game for me to rate. It's a very solid game of football, and the fact that it provides both a solid challenge for single players and a very playable one-on-one competition with a friend can't be understated. But honestly, when playing it, I just kept focusing on the stuff that wasn't there. The sparse intro screen, the lack of selectable options, the minimal formations, the missing fans in the audience. Hell, they didn't even include a coin flip, with the home team always getting the ball first at the beginning of the game and if a game goes into overtime. There is lots of great stuff here, and I do enjoy the game look-in feature that shows the score and sometimes highlights from other games going on, but I can't help but think that the effort to make sure John Madden Football was delivered by Christmas while delaying Joe Montana Football ended up backfiring a bit, as the game certainly could have used some more polish. As a result, I'm giving John Madden Football 3 stars. There is a great game here, and certainly a strong foundation for the future, but there are clearly some kinks that still need to be worked out.
Okay, that was John Madden Football. I'm glad I finally got to play this game, as it's really interesting to see where the series got its start, and to see that as good of a game as it is, it's definitely not perfect, and that the competition between the original John Madden Football and Joe Montana Football was actually much closer than I ever realized. And it makes me excited at the idea of playing the future games in the series just to see where they changed and tweaked things to make improvements, which might sound slightly unusual when talking about sports titles, but keep in mind in these early days it wasn't just about re-releasing the same game with updated rosters. There was still a lot of innovation yet to occur. Next week on Zilog and Moto, I'd originally been scheduled to do another sports game for the Genesis, and yeah, there are a ton of them, but I think 3 weeks of Genesis sports titles in a row is a bit much. So I'm going to push that game back a week, and instead, it's Master System time. And it's time to dust off that light phaser and get some shooting action going. This looks to be a fun one, at least from the screenshots on the box, so hopefully this game is more rescue mission and less marksman shooting, which still might be the lamest attempt at a game that I've ever seen. Ugh. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video. And remember, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.